All right. I know that break went by quickly. It did for me. So in this section, we're going to talk about leveraging inclusive data collection to inform your decisions. And I put together just a brief agenda for this section because we're covering a number of different aspects of data collection and decision making. So first we'll start with a bit about why collect data in the first place, provide some guiding principles on inclusive data collection and analysis, and then get into how to collect and analyze data inclusively, how to communicate about the data collection efforts and use, and how to use data to inform your decisions, outreach, interactions, programming, and more. So just to start off with a bit of discussion from the beginning, what are some reasons you might collect data from and about innovators?
I would have said the most important reason is to make sure you're doing a good job to provide a sort of inclusive service. So make sure you're hitting or providing the appropriate service to all different demographics. So
Yep, it's a great reason. Yeah, Tabitha.
In the theme of what we were talking about in terms of buddy pairing people up, we can pair teams, mentor teams with 2 people, or just teams of 3 people or so if we are collecting data about them and finding commonalities.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. Anyone else have thoughts?
To understand the distribution of innovators across different programs.
Yep.
Certainly from a state perspective, Governor Murphy talks about wanting to make New Jersey the most innovative and inclusive ecosystem. So being able to have data to help, support things that, again, we're doing at a state policy level. It's important to be able to, pull back some of this data that gets aggregated up from our various academic institutions.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes the data that we collect can help us demonstrate the value of the service that we provide and our progress toward meeting our goals in a way that could, in turn, provide more resources to the office to be able to build and grow those services so that you can reach more people. Thanks for that one, Judith. Any other thoughts?
To get a baseline of where the institution is and be able to make comparisons as time goes on.
Yeah, great. Well, I would also add one more, which is to help us have some type of evidence to back up the decisions that we're making about key activities that our office is engaging in. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are all really great examples of why we might want to collect data from and about innovators. So when we're wanting to collect, analyze, and use data inclusively, there are a number of different guiding principles that the research and evaluation community that's focused on inclusive data collection has put together to help shape the way that we approach doing this kind of work. So first is change the system, not the individual. And when I say that, it's coming from a place of recognizing that, like we talked about earlier, there are a number of different barriers that are in place, including bias, that are systemic in nature that may lead to seeing certain kinds of differential impacts, or may lead us to see that, for example, we don't have as many women filing patent disclosures as their counterparts. And one approach to responding to that data or to that evidence could be to say, well, there's something inherently wrong with women. We need to fix women and make them better innovators. Another approach is recognizing that there are a number of systemic barriers that are in the way that make it difficult for women to reach those kinds of milestones. And so what can we do to change the system in response to this data evidence that we have, to make it so that the system is equitable? And so when we're talking about collecting and analyzing and using data from an inclusion perspective, then it's about interpreting the data that we collect from a perspective that lets us see and connect it back to the systemic issues that are at play, rather than blaming the individual, especially if they're from a marginalized background, for some of the patterns that we might see in the data. Another guiding principle is taking ownership over the decisions and priorities that you set. So for example, a lot of times in data collection, we pick categories to put on a survey, for example, because it's something that we see a peer doing, or it's something that we've noticed that gets collected in the census, or it's just ideas that we came up with and decided to put on the survey. And maybe those categories don't necessarily represent the identities of the people that we're trying to understand the experiences of. So taking ownership over those decisions would allow us to be able to hold ourselves accountable for really intentionally putting items on a survey, or within an interview, or collecting specific metrics in a way that lets us move forward on our various goals, but that also are inclusive in nature. So another example is, a lot of times in evaluation surveys, people drop in the data that come from Indigenous participants because the number of participants is too small. And sometimes that's necessary because of privacy reasons. And sometimes that's choosing to prioritize things like statistical significance over meaning. And so even when you have a small number, you can get meaningful information from that population, especially when inclusion is your goal. That if you drop that, you're missing their experiences, you're missing the stories that they might have to tell about what their commercialization journey looks like. So taking ownership over those decisions and recognizing that's a priority that you're setting can really make sure that you're centering inclusion as a priority. The next one is kind of similar, balancing brevity with community-centered identities. So a lot of times we see really short lists of identity categories because we're worried that people won't fill out the survey if we have too many different demographic categories that are there, but they may not represent how members of our community would describe themselves. So the most common one that I see this happening with is with gender. Gender, often people put on surveys male and female, and that's really about biological sex and not about gender identity. And so we really want to make sure that we're careful that we're not putting terms on there that might make people feel excluded just through filling out a survey. And we'll get into this a little bit more. Remembering that assessment and evaluation are activities that reflect power. So that we have a responsibility as folks who would have access to this data to do respectful things with the data and to be transparent about that. Being mindful of context, including external context that might shape experiences. So for example, if you choose on a survey to collect things around citizenship status, and that might put someone at risk because of an external policy around immigration, that may not be something that you want to or need to collect if it means putting someone at risk for sharing that piece of information. The next one is upholding data sovereignty, confidentiality, and privacy. Data sovereignty is really about recognizing that when people share data about their experiences and about their identities with you, that's them giving you something that they want to have some sense of ownership over what happens to it next. And so we have a responsibility to maintain confidentiality and privacy where we can. And that gets down to deciding when and how to share data and how external from our office. The next one is about being transparent about why you're collecting data and what you'll do with it. This really connects very much into data sovereignty. So the more transparent you are with your innovators about why you want data from them and what you plan to do with it, the more likely they are to actually share that data with you, because you're developing trust just by being transparent. And then lastly, always having a purpose for what you're asking and knowing your audience. So don't put an item on a survey or on an interview that doesn't have a purpose, that's just there just because you think that you should collect it, but really make sure that you're going to be making use of every item that you're asking. So those are some basic principles that can guide your data collection efforts, as well as the analysis and how you make use of the data. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was really how can we collect and analyze data inclusively? And I have a number of different examples. Erin, if you wouldn't mind helping me out and putting the link in the chat for me while I'm talking about this. The table with the table that's to the left on this slide, it comes from the NSF Includes Aspire Alliance, which is an inclusion effort funded by the National Science Foundation around faculty and student equity. And they pulled a whole bunch of research. So you can see in the rightmost column of this table references to the research that's about, like, why do we collect these kinds of categories, and why might they be important to you? And they provide a couple of different options for points of comparison here. So and the column, the third column in this instance, is the one that they recommend. That's all in red here, because of what the research recommends. Now, again, this could be a different set of categories for you based on the audience that you have, the purpose that you have for collecting the data, and what you plan to do with it once you've collected it. One of the recommendations is always to have an option for people to write in their own response if they don't see their identities reflected in the list that you have, and always providing an option for them to prefer not to respond because they may not feel comfortable sharing that information. So you can see here that they grouped Indigenous folks from a variety of different regions together in their first category, and put Asian or Asian American, Black or African American, Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic together to recognize that there are multiple terms that people like to use, Middle Eastern or Northern African, Pacific Islander, white, and multiracial, and allowing people to select all of the options because they may identify with multiple of these categories. On the right side, you can see an example from one of the grants that I'm a PI on, which is the Advanced Resource and Coordination Network grant. And we crowdsourced our categories with our community, asking, what language would you use to describe yourself? What would you like to see here? And one thing that surprised me that rose to the top was that a number of folks wanted to see in a race or ethnicity related question a category to be able to indicate that they have Jewish heritage. And so we ended up adding that to our list because the community asked for it. We also separated out Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, as well as Latino, Latinx, because of the request to delineate between the different Latin American countries, specifically calling out Mexican heritage. So there are a variety of different ways that you can do it, but we put a lot of thought into it and got feedback from our community is basically the principle that I'm trying to put forward here. And if you're looking for a starting place, the Aspire Alliance recommendations are a really good place for you to start asking, to start using to ask for some of this information. Next is around gender. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of folks end up just putting male, female, other for gender. This is often experienced as exclusionary by a number of different people, not just folks who identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming, but also people who identify as cis women and cis men, for example, may not want to be identified by biological sex. So there are a couple of options that are listed here. Research recommends the third option again, with a mark all that apply. And you can always kind of roll categories together once you've collected it, but you can't ever disaggregate it if you've already started from too much of a grouped category. So for example, if this just said man, woman, other, you would miss so many of these other components that are in here that you could later roll up, but you can't unroll it once you've had them respond to an other category. On the ARC network, we ask for things such as transgender identity a little bit differently than they do with Aspire Alliance. And the reason that we do this, where you can check all that apply and we have transgender here, and you can also select man or woman or non-binary, is that we know from experience and from research that there are a lot of transgender folks who don't identify as man or woman, but maybe transgender and pangender, or transgender and non-binary. And so the more that you can think about how people want to self-describe, the better off you'll be. And the more inclusive your survey will be. Another thing that I wanted to put as an example, just in case your office ever wants to ask about pronouns so that you have that for when you're having conversations with folks. Here's a really great example of some pronoun questions that you can ask and some options that you could share. And again, once Erin drops that link in the chat, you'll be able to see this full document. Next is sexual orientation. A lot of folks tend to feel uncomfortable adding this kind of question to a survey if they've never had it on there before. But we know from the research around innovation and entrepreneurship that this plays a huge role in people's experiences. So we would recommend that you include some categories related to this. And there's always the option for people to say, I prefer not to share this with you. I'm not comfortable letting you know this component of my identity. And then they don't have to share it. And so here are two different examples of categories that you might use if you want to include some questions around sexual orientation. And lastly, we decided that we would share some information around disability status here. Now, there are a couple of different approaches to thinking about disability status when it comes to survey data. Some folks prefer to do this in a way that has to do with formal diagnosis or medicalizing disability, where it's like, if you've been formally diagnosed as having a disability or an impairment, what kind of disability or impairment do you have? And please indicate it here. And that's what you see in the red from Aspire Alliance. From the ARC network perspective, we were more concerned about people's experiences of barriers due to a disabling condition or environment than we were a formal diagnosis. Knowing that a lot of people may struggle with things like chronic illness or disability, but have not been able to go through a formal diagnosis process to be able to get support and resources that they need. So we chose to use the language of, regardless of whether you've gone through a formal process or received a diagnosis, do you have a disability or chronic condition or experience normative environments as disabling? And then they have the option here to respond. We weren't really concerned about what type of disability that it was. It was more wanting to make sure that we could provide support and resources around experiencing the world from disability or chronic illness perspective. Any questions about these things before I move on to the next piece?
So Erin, do you ever see about asking about military veteran status? I know from a state perspective, sometimes we have different incentives and points for people who may have had military service.
Yes, yes. We actually have some questions like that on the ARC network survey about whether they're a military veteran, active duty military, or military spouse, and collect that kind of information. We also ask a variety of questions around career stage. And this Aspire Alliance document, particularly for academic settings, is really helpful in asking for things like tenure track status, those kinds of things. But yes, to answer your question, we do ask questions around military status. Any other questions? Okay. So next, to complicate things just a little bit further, there is the work around intersectionality that I wanted to point out, and we've talked about this before briefly, is intersectionality is this idea that a person walks through the world with multiple identities that they hold, and that those identities intersect in unique ways that shape their experiences related to power, privilege, and oppression. So it's again about systems and how we walk through the world, and how systems treat us based on the identities that we hold. So for example, we have, let me see. For example, a Black woman with a disability doesn't experience her STEM workplace only as a woman or only as a Black person or as a person with a disability, but through her own unique interaction with all three systems simultaneously. And this body of work comes from women of color feminism, and a lot of scholarship that recognize that movements for gender equity and movements for racial equity were leaving people out who are at the intersections of those categories. So for example, the feminist movement largely focused on the experiences of white women, whereas Black rights movement largely focused on the experiences of Black men, and neither one really fully supported the experiences of Black women. So it's really important that we look at these categories simultaneously to be able to understand who we might be leaving out. So we recommend that as you're collecting data and looking at it, that you make sure that, for example, when you look at gender, you also simultaneously look at race to make sure that your programs aren't just benefiting white women and leaving women of color behind, but the women of color are also benefiting from your programs. And I can give you one example of how this has played out in my own research. So this is based on national level NSF data, where there was a survey of folks who earned STEM degrees, and looking at the primary reason why people with STEM degrees took a job outside of the field of their degree. And I analyzed the data by both gender and race. And the reason that I did this is because a lot of the literature that used this data was grouping all of women together and saying that women were leaving STEM because of family reasons. And yet my own research was showing that it was more complicated than that. And so I was really curious, if we intersect these categories, what might we learn? And you can see that for some folks, family is a really important reason. So Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander folks, some white women also experience family as one of their top 4 reasons. They kind of had a tie across 4 reasons. And then other folks, it was a little bit of a different picture. So for Hispanic women, the number 1 reason had to do with working conditions. That's why they were leaving their field of their degree. For Black and Indigenous women, it was that jobs were unavailable and they were having a very hard time finding a job in the field where they got their degree. So despite this narrative that we hear of it's really hard to find and recruit women of color, it's really hard to find and recruit Black women and Indigenous women in particular into different jobs. Black and Indigenous women were saying, jobs are not available to me. No one is hiring me in my field, so I had to take a job somewhere else. For Asian women, it was about pay and promotion. And so when we learn about these different reasons, rather than sinking all of our resources into solely into dealing with things like parental leave and work-life integration, which are very important issues, we can also recognize that we need to be doing some work around making sure that we're not leaving Black and Indigenous women out of different job opportunities, that we're improving the working conditions in these STEM jobs so that we can retain Hispanic women, that we're paying attention to pay and promotion so that we're not losing folks, Asian American women in particular, to other job opportunities. So it really lets us make more informed decisions about where we need to invest our resources and where we might be leaving people behind. Any questions about that before we move on to the communication piece?
Let me just add something too. We've done another really useful way that this has been used is mapping out how people learned about a program. We were working with an accelerator and they were asking us to do some of this analysis work about their recruitment process. And so we matched up how they were hearing about the program with demographic characteristics. And it turned out that they actually got a significant number of Black inventors to apply through a newsletter from the Department of Energy. But those pool was not reflected in the final cohort because most of the people who had been sent through to those final rounds were people who had heard of the program by word of mouth, so people who were in their networks. So being able to understand, that goes back to everything that we were just saying in the last section about networks, but also, changing your outreach, or understanding where folks are coming from is a important way of understanding like how, where your recruiting and outreach efforts are going and how they're being effective.
Thanks, Erin. That's a great example. Okay, so Erin, communication.
Okay, so we want to remember our guiding principles, upholding data sovereignty, confidentiality, and privacy. Having a statement at the beginning of your instrument tool saying, how it will be kept private, how the data will be used, what the purpose is for, builds a lot of trust and helps people gives them the information to make a better decision about whether they're going to participate in the survey or not. You want to share that you're trying to improve your office's efforts to support all faculty in commercializing. And then we want to follow up with folks to be able to say, we looked at this, we asked for your data, we looked at it, we've made some changes, and here's what we learned, and that is also very trust building. And then getting really specific about the anonymity and privacy is really important, because a lot of times people are wary because they think that their demographic information is going to get tied to their application somehow, and being able to make sure that doing what's possible to keep those separate is really important. Do you have anybody have any other thoughts about how to communicate with innovators about the data that you're collecting? Tony.
So I have to say, so it's this privacy and anonymity part which is like the biggest worry for me in this process. So, and the biggest like barrier to us for like, for example, putting this on invention disclosure forms, for example, and I should say thank you for all the sort of previous slides about how to ask these questions, because that's hugely helpful for us. And the reason I say it's the challenge is because we're talking about relatively small sample sizes. So I don't know how, given that, we can promise anonymity if we're sort of releasing. I don't know. We're going to be getting the data and we're going to be using it to track the sort of demographics of our inventors. But as I say, I just don't know. Given we're probably talking about like 100 sort of such disclosures a year. That's a relatively small sample size. Can we absolutely guarantee that you won't be able to identify who is who and in that sort of data set? It's a sort of fairly small community. So
yeah, so I think a couple of things. One is most of the time concerns about anonymity and privacy come up when the data are going to be released somewhere outside of your office. So like if you were to issue a report on the state of invention disclosures on your campus, for example, and looking at inclusion related to that, that might raise some concerns. But you could say that we're only going to share information at the highest levels of aggregation so that people are not identifiable. So for example, you may collect all of those categories that I listed around race and ethnicity and gender identity and sexual orientation. But when you report the data out to the community, in order to protect anonymity and privacy. You may end up, for example, grouping women and gender minorities together in a category so that you're protecting the identities of folks who are non-binary or trans, right? Depending on how you collect the data. You may be grouping it together where it's like you're talking about white innovators and innovators of color, right? So this is where that rolling it back up comes into play. Is you can roll it up to protect privacy, but for internal purposes, when you're making decisions, the disaggregation matters to help you see, like, oh, we have a couple of Indigenous women who have come through our office, and they both have expressed this kind of experience that we might want to do something about. So it's a matter of how you use data internally versus how you share it externally that really becomes the biggest concern around anonymity and privacy. And if you're collecting data as part of an invention disclosure, you may want to break your form into two parts, where the form that gets submitted as part of the formal disclosure is different than the data that you're collecting internally for your office. Similar to like when people file a grant application, you complete your demographic data totally separately than you do for your grant submission. Same kind of idea. Does that help?
It does. It does. It's a slightly, it is a tricky thing to communicate, you know, with that sort of nuance and complexity. I mean, we're actually at the moment going to we're moving to transition to a sort of online system, at which point actually it'd be much easier to anonymize demographic data after that. At the moment, we're still sort of, relatively simple system where it is a little harder, where it's as we do it at the moment, it's not possible really to decouple it into parts of information, but maybe, even as we start to transition to doing everything online, we may be able to do that more easily. So
Tabitha.
I was just thinking about this discussion, and one of the strengths of having this consortium is that maybe we can, in order to anonymize the data and really look at it, maybe we can aggregate across institutions, if that would be in some way useful, using a common survey and aggregating across multiple institutions.
Yeah. I'd imagine you'd want to remove like name information off of any survey like that, but just the demographics would be okay. Yeah.
Yeah, actionable would be hard because the different institutions are managing things differently, but
yeah, great idea. All right, let's look at the next section.
So now that we've collected all of this data, what are we going to do with it? So going back to our guiding principles, we want to change the system and not the individual. So how is the office supporting the inventors that are going through, and not trying to make them conform into a system that doesn't work for them, and also being really clear about that purpose is incredibly important. That is the difference for a lot of people about whether they want to participate in a survey or not. So thinking about how gathering data might have an impact on innovators' experiences, goals, and outcomes that might shape your outreach efforts, who you're reaching out to, when you're reaching out to them. Are you connecting with folks while they're in the middle of their study, and having them understand, like, okay, this is what you might need to think about to prepare. And then, what kind of support and training is offered? How is it offered and to whom? So one of the things in the paper that the autumn paper that we referenced earlier is that a lot of the survey respondents were familiar with commercialization training that was on campus, but they didn't know if they're about existing programs that were specifically targeted to women, or B, the programs were designed in a way that made it a lot more challenging for women to participate. So, for example, oftentimes these programs will have sessions from, say, 5 to 7 p.m. after the workday, so it's not interfering with work. But that's a time when caregivers dealing with young children, that's like prime time. So that's not something that is easy to get out of, and so that sets it up to be exclusionary. And then finally, commercialization outcomes and for whom. We talked about before there being a perception of resources flowing to established faculty who are mostly Caucasian men. So being able to be more observant and intentional about who and what is offered and what those outcomes are. And then finally, getting clear on the purpose for collecting data and setting metrics. What do you hope to learn? What is the purpose of asking the different questions, and what will you do with it? And then what changes is your office actually able to make? Some things, there's university-wide policies that it gives you very little wiggle room in terms of your ability to try new things, but having an understanding of what the options are can help you get to the data, asking the questions that will get you the data that will support those changes. All right. So